method. This building, this inn, located just off the I-94 expressway from Ann Arbor and Detroit, just before it dead ends into Pine Grove Avenue on the north end of town, is now known as the Econo Lodge. But in the 60s, when it was first built, it was known as the Holiday Inn. I first became aware of it, and for several years thereafter, I'm talking about 66 through 69, it had a certain reputation as a place for scoring, either sexually or in terms of drugs, or perhaps in terms of gambling. It was a place where the action was. At least that was the impression I had. However, in late June of 1969, I departed this country and moved to Australia. This would have been a couple of weeks before the alleged moon landing in July of 69. I say alleged because I don't believe this moon landing ever took place, but that's neither here nor there. I was away from Port Huron, from the entire state of Michigan, for almost 4 years, until late May of 1973. Until Christmas Eve 1970 in Australia, and from Christmas Eve 1970 until January 20th, 1973, the date of Nixon's second inauguration, in Hawaii. It was while I was living in Honolulu, attending the University of Hawaii, during the latter part of the month of May 1972, just before the time in which I received my MBA degree from the University of Hawaii. On the night when I first met a woman named Inga Fischer, originally a native of Berlin. Later, she moved to New York City and still later to Hawaii. On the night in question, we'd been smoking pot, getting to know each other. She asked me where I was from. Some paranoia made me reply that it was just a small, insignificant place. I'm sure you've never heard of it, Inga. To which she replied, "How do you know? Why are you so paranoid?" To which I replied, "I'm from Port Huron." And she replied, "Yes, I have heard of it. I just read an article naming Port Huron, Michigan in the news media just a few weeks ago. So what's so important about Port Huron that it'd be in the New York Times?" I asked. "You may have heard of Arthur Bremer," she replied. "Wasn't he the guy that tried to assassinate George Wallace a few weeks ago?" She said, "Yes, that's the one." To which, and she continued, that investigators claimed that backtracking Bremer's movements during several weeks prior to this assassination attempt, it was discovered that several weeks before he shot Wallace, he'd been arrested in Port Huron at the Holiday Inn, which he was then registered, on a charge that he'd been shooting his pistol into the walls of his room or suite or whatever. And then, after having spent some few hours or overnight in jail, he went before a judge and pled guilty to a misdemeanor, paid a fine, his pistol was returned to him, and he was told to get out of town, and he did get out of town. And a few weeks later, tried to assassinate presidential candidate George Wallace. And that's how Inga concluded I read about Port Huron in the New York Times. Well, the name Inga Fischer, although I didn't tell her this, had certain previous associations with me relating to someone I'd met in the 6th grade at the Woodrow Wilson School in Port Huron, also from Germany. I think it's quite significant that the event was never publicized, neither at the time, that is, it was never publicized in Port Huron, but afterwards, after Bremer was publicized as a man who tried to and come close to killing George Wallace. It was never publicized in the Port Huron media about his previous arrest run-in with the Port Huron Police Department in the Holiday Inn several weeks earlier. It was never publicized in Port Huron, but it was somehow publicized in the New York Times, which just happened to have read by Inga Fischer, whom I just happened to have met and just happened to have had that conversation with and seemed to be getting more and more involved with, at least for a short period of time. Since then, I've done quite a bit of informal checking up with people here in Port Huron, and I know now that most of the people living in Port Huron today, 1991, are unaware of this incident. Even, in fact, most of the people who were living in Port Huron at the time in April of 1972, at the time the incident happened, were not aware of it, the incident. Such is the power of the media and or the Port Huron Police Department. Thank you. Aloha. I'm standing in front of the entrance of the Port Huron, excuse me, it's now the Port Huron branch of the St. Clair County Public Library, located about a block west of the City Hall on McMorran Boulevard, the south side of McMorran Boulevard. This library doesn't even have a single copy of any of my written works, the constant theme of which in each of them is that Port Huron is the testing ground where the intelligence community tests out new and ever more sophisticated forms of surveillance and or mind control. While most people think of mind control as associated with the Central Intelligence Agency, those who are a little more sophisticated associated with the Office of Naval Intelligence, and those who have been fortunate enough to have had millionaire grandparents may associate it with something even deeper, or at least older, to wit, the orders of Freemasonry. Although I've always known from the way my mother talked about her father, Professor Wheel, a 32nd degree Mason, that the Masons were the most oldest and most successful practitioners of mind control in the world, at least in the Western world. It is only since my return from Hawaii in the fall of 1989 and my obtaining from the Port Huron Library this book called Where Copper Was King by my paternal grandfather, James North Wright, and reading on page 188, at this period, the Order of Freemasonry possessed prosperous lodges in all the principal settlements in the copper mining district. One was located at the Wisconsin mine, and to it most of the officers of the mine belonged. Hayden had already been initiated, and there were members scattered about in the small mining locations in the immediate vicinity. Hayden is the lead character of this book, written by my grandfather, James North Wright, and published by Small Maynard Company in Boston in 1905, the year my mother was born, and in which my father, Hayden Lockwood Wright, would have been 7 or 8 years old. In any case, I now have at least this much evidence that both my grandfathers were millionaires, and apparently both were Masons. Although my father, despite having the same name as the lead character Hayden in the book, to the best of my knowledge, never joined